Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Jodi Picoult's new novel, Wish You Were Here, begins in New York City in March of 2020. As a young art professional, Diana O'Toole is about to embark on a trip to the Galapagos with her surgical resident boyfriend, soon-to-be-fiancé. But then a virus that felt worlds away appears in the city. What unfolds is a deeply moving novel about the resilience of the human spirit in the moment of crisis. Jodi Picoult is the author of 25 best-selling novels, including My Sister's Keeper, House Rules, and Small Great Things. Again, the new novel is Wish You Were Here, and it's a pleasure to welcome Jodi Picoult to this week's book show. Jodi, thank you very much for being with us. A great pleasure to have you back on the program.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I love this book. I was fascinated by this book, and as you say in it, this book set a land speed record, and you write pretty quick anyway.
Yeah. This book, I started writing in November of 2020, and I finished in January.
So by comparison, why is that so fast?
I mean, usually it takes me about 9 months to do a first draft between research and actual writing. You know, for me, this kind of grew out of my own inability to wrap my head around the pandemic. When I went into lockdown, I really went into lockdown. I have, asthma, and I was terrified of getting COVID before I was vaccinated. When I stayed home for 15 months. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't go grocery shopping, nothing. I just went hiking in the hills of New Hampshire. And basically, I worked on a different manuscript that I had been contracted to write with a co-author, which is coming out in 2022. But the end of the year came around and we still didn't have vaccines, and I still was going nowhere. And for me, writing Wish You Were Here was my way of making sense of a lost year. It was my way of also finding meaning for my life when my life was overturned. And I think it also was a way for me to have a blueprint to move forward as we begin to learn how to live with COVID-19 in the world, because it's just not going away anytime soon. I didn't plan to publish it. I wrote it quickly because it was like pouring out of me. And it wasn't until a couple of writer friends read it, and they both said almost the same thing, which was, this felt like the hug I couldn't get in 2020. And I thought, what if it's not just therapeutic for me? What if it's therapeutic for other people? Hence the land speed record and getting it published as well.
I mean, one of the things that comes through so clearly in this book is that this is a pandemic, and this is something that can be and is to many, many people life-changing.
I think that the thing that surprised me the most was how I can't plan anymore. None of us really can plan anymore. For me, one of the things I learned about myself was that I truly am a control freak, and that was really hard for me. You know, I wanted to write this book about a woman who has her whole life planned out until she doesn't, because the universe says, not going to happen for you. So what do we learn when we stop making plans? What do we learn when we have to rely on our resources to get through the days? And the days are very hard because we're out of our comfort zone. What happens to Diana O'Toole, the main character in the novel, is very much metaphorical for what happened to all of us during the pandemic. And yet I would argue that what I really want to get across here is that we have learned a lot during the past 18 months or so. You know, we've learned that it's okay to grieve. Everyone's lost something. Depending on, what age you are, I can tell you what you've lost. It could be in-person schooling. It could be a prom. It could be a wedding. It could be, in my case, 8 years of work on a Broadway-bound show that was going to debut, and it didn't happen because Broadway shut down. It depends. Could be the loss of a loved one, which is the ultimate loss. We like to pretend that my loss is worse than your loss and play that game, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is that we all feel that hole of something that we didn't get that we wanted. I think the other thing is that we've all realized that success is measured differently now. Had you asked me in 2019 what success was, I would have said, it's a title, it's a degree, it's a promotion, it's a raise, it's a slot on a bestseller list. Now I would say, am I healthy? Are my kids healthy? Do I have a roof over my head? Do I have enough food? Am I able to hold the hand of someone I love when they're dying? I mean, who knew that was going to be a privilege, right? The other thing that we have to recognize is that once we understand what we've learned about ourselves in the past 15, 18 months, What do you do with that knowledge as the world begins to open up? Do you go right back into the rat race, or do you say, I've adjusted my priorities and now I'm going to adjust my life accordingly too, and not forget everything that we've learned? The world is forever changed. It's not going back to the way it used to be, but we're changing too, and we have evolved because of this.
Jodi, I've been doing this show for a long time, and I say this often, but sometimes books are more difficult than others to discuss because you don't want to give anything away. Yours is really hard. Really, really hard.
I'm sorry.
It's not your fault
I know.
at all. And again, without giving anything away, but you essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you essentially wrote almost 2 separate novels.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, what I will say without giving anything away is that I know I've become known for twists in my books.
Right.
And in 30 years, I think this is the biggest twist that I've ever written. I'm really excited because so far nobody has seen it coming. So it makes me feel like I did a good job.
Absolutely. No, I did not see it coming at all. So let's talk about the parts that we can talk about, because we learn about Diana, and Diana is just about to turn 30, and she works for Sotheby's, and the career is going really well. And in fact, she's about to do this career-defining thing, and then of course the pandemic happens. Now, give us a sense of what brought you to Diana, and also what brought you into the art world, because that's really fascinating. I learned much about Toulouse-Lautrec, and then I found out that the Toulouse-Lautrec that you wrote about isn't even a real Toulouse-Lautrec, and I only know that because I searched it and I couldn't find it.
Joe, you're not the first to tell me that. Diana is an art specialist at Sotheby's, and she comes by this profession because she comes from a family of artists. Her mother is kind of like the female Ansel Adams, is a photographer, has won Pulitzer Prizes, and goes to war-torn and disaster-ridden parts of the world to capture its effect on humanity. And as a result of that, she wasn't home much when Diana was little. So there's a lot of resentment going on there. Diana's father, who is deceased when the novel opens, was not an artist, but a conservator, meaning he didn't create his own art, but he replicated and fixed art that other people made, whether it was architectural or painted or whatever. And the very first scene in the book shows him replicating the ceiling at Grand Central Station, which actually was painted in reverse inadvertently. And of course, a conservator is not going to fix the mistake. He's just going to make it new all over again. So Diana has this really a lightning strike moment when she is in college, and she realizes she doesn't want to be an artist like her mother. She doesn't want to be anything like her mother, which is why she gets into the business of art and works for Sotheby's and sort of trains her whole career that way. The reason that I wanted art to be part of this is because Diana specifically works with impressionists like Toulouse-Lautrec. There's a scene in the book where she reflects her father taking her to the Brooklyn Museum to see her first impressionist paintings. And he brings her up very close to a Monet and covering her eyes so she can't see, and stops a few inches away from the canvas. And when he takes his hand away, all she sees are very pretty blue and green blobs. But he covers her eyes again and pulls her back, and she realizes when she looks again, oh, this is a haystack. Oh, this is a cathedral. Oh, these are water lilies. And the thing about impressionist paintings is that they're meant to be that way, blurry and fuzzy, until you have the distance and the perspective to really understand what you're looking at, which is the perfect metaphor for this pandemic. We are just now getting to the point where we have the distance, the objectivity, and the science, thanks to vaccines, I think, to put this into a little more perspective and to be a little less freaked out about it, because we at least now feel like we have a little bit of armor in a war that we never planned to fight. I wanted to bring that metaphor into the book, the idea that art is something that you need a certain distance and perspective for to really appreciate. The thing that's fascinating about art is that if you look at a painting when you are 13 years old, and then you don't see that painting again until you're 30, it's going to hit you differently. And then that's true of any art, whether you read the same book or you see a movie or a musical decades apart, or hear a piece of classical music. And the reason isn't because the art is changing. The art doesn't change. The art is static. You're changing. And art is a partnership between the person who creates it and the person who receives it. And the person who receives it is constantly in flux. So what we bring to pieces of art alters depending on who we are at the moment. And we do continue to change. And that was another element of this book that I really wanted to explore.
We should mention Diana is a very accomplished artist. She is very good. However, when she first, as she's doing this, and her father gets involved, he said, "You're definitely your mother's daughter."
Mother's daughter. Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
she did
And
not
exactly
take that as a compliment and knew she wanted to do something else.
Yeah, that's actually the impetus for her to move in another direction. And of course, part of Diana's journey here is not just a physical one, which you see, but an emotional journey as well, kind of understanding that perhaps she has more in common with her mother than she thought or than she would have liked to think.
And it was because she had this checklist and had so much of her life planned. She is, as we begin the novel, she's about to fly off to the Galapagos with her boyfriend, Finn, who is a surgical resident, and everything is going to plan until the pandemic. And Finn is told that he can't leave the hospital because they need him. And he turns to Diana and says, "Well, look, the vacation's paid for. You should go." And she goes. And that's, I guess, is a really huge decision, not only for an individual, but certainly for a relationship.
Absolutely. And it's especially a huge decision for Diana because Diana likes her life neat and orderly. And Diana knows exactly what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. She knows she's about to get a promotion. She believes that she and Finn are going on this bucket list vacation. And she has this inkling that Finn is going to propose to her there, and there begins the rest of her life. And she knows where she wants to move and when she wants to have kids and all those things. Of course, none of it goes according to plan. And when Finn tells her you should go, she winds up in a country where she doesn't speak the language, in the Galapagos. She gets to Isabella Island and is told that the island is closing for 2 weeks, whatever that means. And she decides, well, I'm just going to stay here for 2 weeks. That's how long my trip was going to be anyway, only to discover that her accommodations have fallen through, that she still doesn't speak the language. She doesn't have any Wi-Fi or cell service because it's kind of a desert of technology. And she is at the mercy of strangers. And that is so not Diana. So she's already launched out of her comfort zone. And then she can't stay in contact with Finn, who is experiencing a very, very different pandemic than the one Diana is on the Galapagos. Finn is a frontline worker in New York City when things are truly terrible at the beginning of March and into April. He sporadically, through very scattered emails and voice messages that managed to come through by a fluke, conveys what it was like to be on the front lines as a physician during that time.
Jodi Picoult is our guest. The name of the new novel is Wish You Were Here. Why the Galapagos?
I wish there was a better explanation than this, but the story that got me thinking about how to wrap my head around the pandemic is a real-life story about a Japanese tourist who got stranded at Machu Picchu during the pandemic. He went there, of course, to see the historic site, and the country closed down. And instead of going back home to Japan, he actually wound up staying in the community and teaching kids martial arts and eventually becoming such a fixture that the locals petitioned the government to open the historic site for him. And he got a dawn private viewing of Machu Picchu, which nobody ever gets, months after he had first gone there as a tourist. And I thought, that is really cool. I've never been to Machu Picchu. It's 2020. I'm not going to Machu Picchu. So what are some other bucket list destinations that I might have been to? For me, that was the Galapagos. I took my kids when they were really, really little. It's been years since we've been there, but I went downstairs and I pulled out all my photo albums to, kind of see what it looked like, what I could remember, and what I could write about. And honestly, that was the decision-making process for me. I was like, okay, I've been to the Galapagos. I'm going to write about this. It wasn't until I started writing that I really remembered Galapagos, Darwinism, survival of the fittest, natural selection. And it felt like a metaphor had dropped right into my lap. The whole concept of Darwin's theory of evolution is that if a species faces great adversity, either they adapt or they don't survive. And honestly, I cannot think of a better way to describe the human race in 2020.
As we see through Diana, she's reevaluating everything, the relationships, the choices, herself, wondering when she gets back home, will she evolve into somebody new? How has she evolved into somebody new?
Right, exactly. And of course, when you change, all of a sudden, the structures and the high water marks that you've set for yourself suddenly may hurt a little or pinch or rub the wrong way. I think many of us were in a situation in 2020 where we stopped the hamster wheel. We stopped running toward whatever it was, whatever that golden ring was that we were trying to catch, because the universe pressed pause. And when you stop running and you look around, you think, why did I want that in the first place?
For a lot of reasons, there's a lot of grieving in this book, isn't there?
I don't think it would be a story about 2020 and human resilience if we didn't talk about grief. A lot of people lost people that they loved during this pandemic. And a lot of the doctors felt the overwhelming grief of not being able to heal people, which is why they got into the profession in the first place. I needed to acknowledge that, and I needed to take their stories, the ones that they shared with me when I was doing research, and distill them into fictional format so that I could honor really all that happened.
It's fascinating because there are those stories from patients, but also stories. I mean, Finn, in writing to Diana while she is in the Galapagos, are these regular dispatches of just the horror that he's seeing every day as Diana is reading this in quote-unquote paradise.
Absolutely. And I will tell you that I did extensive research with frontline medical professionals, nurses, doctors, not just in America, but in other places. But I was very specific. I really, really wanted to talk to young residents whose residency was completely dismantled by COVID. When you're a surgical resident and there are no elective surgeries, guess what happens? You get assigned to the COVID ICU. All of a sudden, you have 20 patients on your service and 18 of them are dying a day. And you're spending 48 hours trying desperately to chase whatever the next best thing is to try to treat this. You wake up in the morning and you read your email and you're like, okay, this drug is out, but we're going to try this. Oh, some guy in Oregon is flipping people onto their bellies. We're going to try that now. Nobody knew what was going to work. It was like throwing stuff at a wall to see what stuck. For them, the cognitive dissonance of being in a hospital where it was death, 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 death for 48-hour shifts, and then walking out, many cases not even going home because they were afraid of infecting their families, but going, say, to a Starbucks to get a coffee, and your barista says something like, COVID, fake news, or you turn on the TV and the president says, just drink bleach, you'll be fine. You cannot imagine how debilitating that was for these physicians, how that cognitive dissonance ate away at them. And I honestly think we have done such a disservice to the medical community. We're starting to see it now in 2021 as people are leaving or retiring in droves. We also really are going to have to address some of the mental health challenges that they faced in 2020 that we have not even had the time to think about yet because they're still on the front lines.
You say in the author's note that you couldn't even read at first, and ultimately you went to romance novels because you were looking for a happy ending.
You bet. And God bless those romance novelists because I think they helped a lot of us in 2020. That's what I needed. I needed to know everything was going to be okay. After I managed to, finish a couple of those books, I could move on to YA dystopian worlds because I needed to know there was a place worse than mine. Seriously, that was the trajectory of my reading. And then I was like, oh, okay, I remember how to read. Then I can read everything again. But I needed to sort of rejigger myself into being able to focus long enough to take in an entire book.
So again, without giving anything away, I mean, your book ends 2 years from now and in the future. And the question marks are still there as to, well, what a happy ending is.
Absolutely. And the funny thing is I've been asked about this a few times because the book ends in 2023 in what should be a, quote, post-COVID world. And someone said, well, how do you know? And I said, honestly, in January when I finished, I still did not have a vaccine. I still did not know when I was going to be able to get vaccinated. I was still terrified. And I thought, okay, I know they're working on these vaccines. So I'm going to guess that by the end of 2021, everyone will be vaccinated, because who wouldn't want that vaccine? At the time, my brain could not even imagine that there were people who wouldn't take it. Then I thought that gives us 2022 to sort of begin to fight this virus on an equal footing. And that means that by 2023, we should be coming out of it.
Right.
And, now I wonder, maybe that was a little aspirational. Maybe that was just me hoping that this is what the world is going to look like one day. I said it in 2023. The reality is I don't actually believe we ever will eradicate COVID. I think it will hopefully get to a point where it's like the flu, where if you catch it, you likely will not be hospitalized. You likely will not die. It's been diluted enough because of vaccination among the global population that there aren't host bodies left for those mutations to happen that make it more deadly. That's my hope. That's my hope for the future.
Carolyn Levitt is a great friend of this program and is just the best. We have talked many times about her novels, and as I said, as a very good friend, and you leaned on her because of some of her experiences. But when you talked about your writer friends early on, I mean, that was very helpful for you to decide to say, okay, this is something we can explore.
Oh, yeah. For me, I'm trying to remember why it was that she reached out to me. And it must have had something to do with a call that I put on social media for research. I, too, am friendly with Carolyn Levitt. She is just the most beautiful, gorgeous writer and such a kind and generous person as well. She reached out to me and she was like, Jodi, oh my gosh, I have to tell you my story. And I was like, I basically did an interview with her the way I did with many other people without giving too much away, used a lot of the real life experiences of her own illnesses and things that she survived to help me shape what I was trying to sort of wrap this novel around a little bit.
We touched on this and then we got away from it, but what goes into creating a work of Toulouse-Lautrec?
Okay, so honestly, I know very little about art, but one of the silver linings of this pandemic for me was that my adult children, 2 of my adult children out of 3, and their partners were all quarantining at a lake house that we own that's about 45 minutes away from my house. And on weekends, when we all got to a certain point, we merged our bubbles. We were able to have dinners with them and, run a little hair salon in my bathroom so that I could cut everybody's hair and things like that. So Melanie, who is the fiance of my son, Jake, in fact, the last thing I did before the world shut down was go watch him propose to her in Colorado. She is an artist and an art historian who studied it at Yale and has worked in the art industry and has many friends that have the same kind of job that Diana does. So when I started to come up with the idea of incorporating Diana's career with art, I said to Melanie, okay, I need your help. Luckily, Melanie was not doing a lot at that moment because we were in the middle of a pandemic. And so I said, not only do I need her to be an art specialist, and not only do I need to know what that actually entails, I need her to be on the cusp of selling a really special piece of art. Let's make up a piece of art. And Melanie actually wound up, doing a deep dive into all the Impressionists and finally said, I think it's got to be Toulouse-Lautrec, and here's why. And Toulouse-Lautrec was a really interesting guy because he came from aristocracy. His parents were aristocrats in France. He had skeletal dysplasia, so he was very physically compromised. But his parents didn't mind that as much as they minded the fact that he was sort of this free spirit artist. They hated that he was an artist. He was very interested in the dichotomy between what you show the world and what your private feelings and emotions are. And he's very well known for taking up residence in brothels in Paris and painting about the private lives of the sex workers who were there. So there's a whole series he does called Lily, which are beautiful, very intimate pictures of these women in bed with each other. And those are their real relationships. The cozy morning of rolling over to someone you love and just looking at them on a pillow, that's the reality as opposed to what they show when they are entertaining their clients. I love that idea that what we show the world is not always what is in our heart, because I think that the pandemic also cast that into greater relief for many of us. And in some cases, made us realize that maybe it was dishonest, the things that we showed the world. Maybe we do need to listen more to our inner selves. So, the idea of creating a painting that was an offshoot of his series, Toulouse-Lautrec's offshoot, Lili, was to incorporate one that put him, the artist himself, into the painting with his paramour, and showed sort of the real life, this is who I really am. And Toulouse-Lautrec did not do many self-portraits, and when he did, they tended to be from the waist up so that you weren't always seeing his deformed legs. And I like that idea. I like that idea that this would be a very special painting that was given to a lover that might be passed down to famous lovers throughout history. And that is sort of the trajectory of the painting that Diana thinks she is about to sell at Sotheby's, which of course does not go according to plan.
The painting ultimately winds up with Kotomi Ito, who would, I think, I'm certainly not the only one, would immediately think of Yoko Ono.
Absolutely. And she is a stand-in for Yoko Ono, and absolutely everything that I was saying about her and creating in her fictional life was meant to parallel what happened with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, to the point where she is accused of breaking up a band and he is killed on the front steps of their fancy building in New York City. Of course they are John and Yoko. But I didn't use the real John and Yoko for very important reasons, and it has to do with everything that we've been talking about. In this book, Kotomi is selling this painting and making decisions based on what she thinks her partner Sam would have wanted had he lived and what their retirement would have been. And I think that I'm sure that John and Yoko had that conversation and knew what they wanted to do when they grew old together. And I didn't think it was right for me to superimpose something fictional over two real-life people like that, especially when it was about, the privacy of a love story, because I think it's really fascinating that Yoko Ono never married again and has been very devoted to John even after his death. And so I decided I would fictionalize them and then give them all the retirement dreams that I wanted.
Jodi Picoult's new novel is Wish You Were Here. It is published by Ballantine. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to find this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.